Greetings, everyone. It's been a long time since I've done one of these videos, and I just figured it was time to do another one. A lot of people have been asking questions on my Tumblr, and I haven't been responding because I'm a bad human being. So I'm going to do 3, maybe 4. We'll see how this goes. Anywho, Happy New Year. Stick Zach asked, hello. I have a question about what the process is like for post-game development, such as how long you can keep working on games after the contracted time is up. Hypothetically, if you could go back and make patches, updates, would you be allowed? How much work goes into it, etc., for both contracted games, Fallout New Vegas, and original properties, Pentiment. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here I think I can answer, hopefully. This year marks my 26th year in the game industry. I've worked on a lot of different games that had a lot of different restrictions and sort of rules around them. You know, when I started, I was working on only PC, it was PC only games, and patching there was pretty straightforward for the most part. The patches were relatively small. At that point, you pretty much were always needed to download them because it was broadband penetration was getting relatively widespread. So usually it was just a matter of, does the company want to spend money paying people to do the work to patch it? And that's really what it comes down to. So first, let me talk about contracted time, paid milestones versus out of pocket. So most of the games that I worked on at Obsidian, we were being contracted by an external publisher, and that publisher would pay us in milestones. And my understanding, because I didn't do contract stuff, my understanding with those contracts is that part of the contract says some of the milestones are for post-launch support. So, you know, the publisher has an interest in having the developers support the game post-launch. Obviously, you want the game to be as bug-free as possible at launch, but there are always bugs, sometimes worse than others. So there's contracted time there. Now, depending on how things go, the publisher may make a new contract to continue supporting it, or they may say, you know, that's enough, we don't want to put more money into this. That doesn't necessarily mean that the developer can't also put time and money into it. However, usually the publisher more or less controls the updating process. So the work is being done by the developer on behalf of the publisher. So even if the developer were to do work, that doesn't mean that the publisher is going to authorize updating it, is going to update or authorize patching it. I believe Tim Kaine has talked about this I forget which of the Troika games, but I believe he has said that they made a patch and the publisher just didn't want to do it. So part of this is because, one, the publisher doesn't want to necessarily do the QA for it or support for it. It could also be because on consoles, it used to, I don't think it does anymore, but it used to cost money to the console manufacturer to patch. And it used to be fairly expensive. From my recollection, I believe it was in the $50,000 a patch range. I think maybe the first 1 or 2 patches were free, but then after that you had to pay money, and that's not nothing. I mean, with today's development budgets, it doesn't sound maybe quite as crazy, but if you're doing a lot of patches, that's going to add up, and if you're a small developer, that's a really big deal. So there might be reasons why the publisher just says, I don't care, you know, like either they don't care because it's not profitable, or they just have other stuff to focus on and they say, no, thank you. Other than that, though, a lot of what it comes down to is the staff cost. So, you know, when a game first launches, you typically will have most of the team, let's say, patching. You know, we're ready, we're waiting, we're watching streams, we're getting reports, you know, through various means that say, here are these problems with the game. We have QA sort of hunt them down, and then we file bugs officially, and then the developers try to fix them. However, usually after the first, I'm just going to say 2 weeks, a lot of the staff is no longer needed to patch. Like the number of issues goes down a lot, hopefully. And you're left with not a huge list of issues to deal with, and so you leave on a decreasing number of people to patch those, and that's where the real cost is. You're paying people to work on that and not work on new things or other projects that you have going on. Obsidian, typically we have multiple projects, 2, 3. We have had 4. It's probably too many at one time, but you have other projects that you could be sending those people to work on. So at a certain point, it's not really efficient because there just aren't that many new bugs coming in, and the number of people on it goes down, and the frequency of patches also goes down. And there is some, like what is the publisher paying for versus what is the developer paying for? Sometimes the developer, because we don't like bugs in our games, so we want to remove them, and so we might have more of an interest in removing them than the publisher does. We might negotiate either like a smaller contract, or some of it might be paid out of pocket, which is not ideal, but that's somehow how it goes. I would also say that role-playing games in particular have what is known in the industry as a long tail. And what that means is that they sell for a long time. Even if they don't necessarily sell gangbusters numbers when they first come out, they don't tend to drop off as severely as games in some other genres do. So, for example, an older isometric game may continue to sell modestly, but still significantly over time and can make a fair amount of money. So there are reasons why you may be motivated to keep patching it with lower frequency and with a smaller staff. So for example, Deadfire, the 5.0 patch, there were only 3 people working on it. There was Nick Carver was the designer on it. Brian McIntosh was the programmer, and Mitch Lloyd was the UI artist. And they did pretty much everything having to do with the turn-based mode. Some other people pitched in here and there, but it was really just those 3 people. So that's not a huge cost. And that was a enormous benefit because a lot of people just don't like real time with pause games. And so adding a turn-based mode made it a lot more appealing to a big segment of the potential audience. And I thought that was like and by the way, that wasn't really my idea. That was all, that was between Nick and Brian for the most part. So very great idea. It added a lot to the game. And I think it's what's contributed to more people picking it up later who wouldn't ever pick up Pillars 1 because the real time with pause combat is just rough for some people. But also, Nick also headed up a lot of the fixes that went into the 2024 Pillars 1 patch. I know, which is crazy. When that was announced, people were like, what are you doing? But, as time goes on, things drift out of sync. There were different versions on different platforms. Some of them were using a newer version of Unity. And so Nick and Jesse, one of our programmers at Obsidian, they worked on it and fixed it all up and ran it through QA, and it was good to go. So, there is benefit to doing that sort of long-term work. You do have to factor in QA as well. The stuff needs to be tested. I mean, it should be tested. And so that's one of the factors that weighs into it as well. So really what it comes down to is theoretically you could spend infinite time, but there's a certain amount of overhead and cost and the process of resubmitting to consoles, which can be arduous and annoying at times. And so at some point you just kind of set it down, if not permanently, just for a while, and then you might pick it back up to patch down the road. All right. The next question is from Otterblogger. Sorry. Hello. Often, we'll see stats that show many people buy games for only a smallish number to complete them. Does that affect how you approach development? Do you have granular enough data that shows when and where in the game the player stopped? From a financial perspective, I would assume that since you, the company, already have the money, there's little impact there. From a design perspective, though, does that affect your decisions? For example, shorter games, more accessibility features, etc. Thanks. You're welcome. So ultimately, we want people to be happy. that they bought the game and they want them to be happy that they played the game, or satisfied. Maybe happy is not the right word, but we want the player to play the game, and whatever amount that they play, we want them to come away and say, I'm glad I bought the game. I enjoyed it. Great. Awesome. So, just having someone's money is not good enough. That's very short-sighted. Because we have reputations to maintain. And we want people to think well of us. So that also goes to patching. We had a reputation for a long time as Bug City'n, which to a certain extent is maintained, even though I do think that most of our recent games, it's not that they don't have bugs, but they're really not too bad in my opinion. Anywho, we want people to think about our games and our studio and have a positive experience. So something that I thought was interesting, and I've told this anecdote before, but in this context, I think it's really relevant. I remember talking to a usability group where we were talking about the size of our games and how we like to make them pretty big and pretty long, even if a lot of the stuff is optional. And one of the researchers said, well, we found that, what is it, like 2/3 or something at the time, 2/3 of people don't finish the games that they start. And they went on to sort of suggest, therefore, you should make shorter games. And I asked what I thought was just the obvious question. I said, how did that correlate to the enjoyment of the player? And they said, we never asked that. I'm like, I think that's really important. I mean, one of the most notable games, I think, where this is really important is a game like Skyrim, a game where a lot of people never finish the crit path. They don't get very far in the crit path at all. They restart the game over and over and over, and they just wander, and they never finish it. They never maybe even see more than 1/3 of the map and its locations, but they love it. Great time. And if you were going by, well, they didn't finish the game, therefore they didn't like it, that's just not true. Like, some players really need to finish the game, but I would say most players, including myself, I'm not that concerned with finishing games. Maybe if I get very deep into them, I get, like 80% of the way through them, then I really want to see it through. But if I have an enjoyable experience out of it, I don't need to finish it. That's not that important. And so, I think that there is a perception of size, a perception of scope. It's that feeling of, when you come out in most Bethesda games, they do a really good job of or The Witcher 3 is another really good example. Actually, I would say Cyberpunk 2077. You get a sense of the true scope of this world, and it kind of takes your breath away, and you're like, oh man, I can just imagine all the stuff that's out there. And you start pushing and testing against the boundaries, and it just feels like it kind of goes on forever. But it doesn't need to go on forever. It just needs to kind of feel that it goes on forever for as long as you want to play the game. And I think that's an important psychological aspect. That said, I will say I do think personally that outside of like console warriors, I don't think that anyone cares. Like, we don't need to get bigger. Just stop. Like, we don't. I don't think most players want games that are like 6 times bigger than Skyrim or, like 8 times bigger than Witcher 3. Games got bigger and bigger, and it became more and more impressive. And then at a certain point, supporting that volume of stuff, there's a quality dip. Like, we're not employing 8 times the number of area designers and artists. And so things start to feel less unique and bespoke. And don't get me wrong, like, we all got to reuse assets. I mean, we don't all have to. Sometimes I'm going to anecdote here. I watched the Double Fine documentary, and what's crazy about that is how everything is sort of bespoke, and which is really great. But it's not the mentality of me making RPGs, where I'm always thinking about how we can reuse stuff, because we know we want to make big games. But that being said, I don't think we need to go bigger anymore. We can kind of chill out, and within a small margin, we can make it a little bigger, a little smaller. Again, as long as the player feels like when they come out in the world that they have a big, vast space to explore, and that is a fun experience and it doesn't feel repetitive, and like a grind, I think that's good. And so I don't mind making big games like that. I think that's fun. I have fun in those worlds. I think a lot of players do too. All right, I think I can do one more of these. This is from Salden SER. Hi, Josh. I've been dissecting the Icewind Dale games for the past couple of days and marveling at the beautiful scenery you guys created. Do you remember how the areas were made? I'm guessing they are isometric photos of a 3D rendered map. If so, which program was used to render them? Also, are all the assets original? Cheers. All right, so from what I recall, and it has been 25 years, so apologies if I forget a few details. To the best of my knowledge, I believe that almost everything at that time was done in 3D Studio Max. We may have changed between Torment and Icewind Dale. I should say that I was at Black Isle during Torment, but I did not work on Torment. I worked with that team for the website, so I have some insight through the art director, Tim Donnelly. So some of it was 3D Studio Max. I don't remember if we were using Maya at that time. Maybe Softimage was used, but my recollection, it was 3D Studio Max. So models would be leveled in 3D Studio Max, and different artists had different techniques and approaches for doing that. For example, Aaron Brown, one of the artists who made some of the craziest areas, had his own way of doing like he did the stuff that's super detailed where there's like a zillion tiny little planks making like a Targos and stuff like that, where it's just the most detailed stuff you've ever seen in your life. The models are crazy. And they would be textured usually. I think they would be textured. Well, people would make the textures usually in Photoshop. And then one exception was that Vance Kovacs, one of our fantastic artists, he would use deep paint on the model. So he was a painter and he was very used to just using deep paint and brush tools. And so, for example, the exterior of Dorn's Deep with the I'm trying to remember the exact area number, but it's the one that's basically all it's covered in ice and snow. Icewind Dale, great. But it's really striking dwarven hall made of ice and snow. And so he hand painted that in deep paint, all the texture work, which is really crazy. Then it would get rendered out. So the rendering would happen over, sometimes it would take like a day from my recollection. This is actually something that came up in Pillars of Eternity. We couldn't have levels that took more than a day to render because it would really, we remembered that if it got longer than that, our ability to iterate was really screwed up. So it would get rendered out and then it would get color corrected, usually by like a technical artist or a 2D artist. I remember Tim Donnelly would say for Torment, he would say, make it super black, which was sort of this way to adjust the curves and the lighting and the color balance to get things to really pop. So the blacks would get really deep black, like true black, and then get these nice like highlights and things like that. So it was, they would push the contrast a lot. And then in many cases, they would get touched up by hand, specifically by Brian Menzie. If there was another artist that did it, I don't remember that. Brian, fantastic at that. There were levels that were completely transformed between the 3D render and the final version in the game. And Brian would go in and he would paint in all these details. They were absolutely just phenomenal. Once that was done, then it would go to, if I recall correctly, either Jason Swin or Scott Everts, and they would make clipping masks. And what the clipping masks were for, excuse me, the clipping mask was for sorting, so that when characters walked behind something in the scene, the clipping mask would sort them properly based on the position. Because it's a 2D game, it's isometric. And I will say that, actually, I should say after that, then it would go through a BioWare tool, because the Infinity Engine was BioWare's engine rather, and then it would get chopped up into tiles. They were, I believe, 64 by 64 pixel tiles. I believe each one of them was 8-bit, and we'd have to do a lot of like really clever stuff to get to make them line up, because sometimes the way it would like map out the colors, you'd get these gradations that it was really technical and crazy. And so there's a lot of technical work that Jason Swin and Scott Everts would do to make those work, because once they went to that 64 by 64 tile size, that's what allowed for basically streaming in memory because we didn't have a ton of memory at that time. So it was a really involved process, but those artists did a fantastic job. I can't take any credit for anything artistic in those games. Yeah, it was really cool. But then that was also used sort of as the template for how we approached Pillars and Deadfire. And what I will say is that because the way that we used depth and depth mapping was so much more precise based on the render, we could do far less 2D touch up in Pillars and Deadfire, because if you started if we started adding things into the scene, like actual objects, there was no data there to sort it. We didn't make clipping masks by hand. They were part of the render. So when it would render it out, it would create that depth mask, and then that would sort things automatically. And so at that point, if we could mess with like texture and light and color balance and things like that. And Brian Menzie, again, did work on that. A lot of artists did great work on that. But that limited us somewhat. But then again, we could put a lot more detail into the scenes to begin with. So I thought it was a fair trade-off. All right, that's it for this week. Maybe I'll do another one next week. Maybe it'll be another 5 months. I don't know. Happy New Year, everybody. Bye.